Hey everybody, good job getting through the second section of this course. I'm sorry if there's a little background noise. I got my dog pushing on the gate trying to get in. He wants to learn about political parties. So let's start section 3. We're going to be covering political parties and really diving into the intermediaries between us, hey guys, and our governments. So political parties, institutions, some hot topics regarding representation, the boundaries of American democracy are all the trends we're going to be covering in the next few weeks. Also, civil liberties and civil rights. So let's dive into some political parties. So the learning objectives of this week are to understand what political parties are and who makes up political parties at multiple levels of their organization. So we'll be diving into some key terms regarding organizational structures of political parties. We're going to look at third parties of US past and some notable elections, three in particular, in which third party candidates obtained a notable percentage of the popular support for the presidential election. So we're also going to identify a key concept. That'll actually be the first thing we do. A key concept between a united and a divided government. I'm so sorry. Cedar's the dog's name. He's a puppy golden retriever. He doesn't like when I give lectures and ignore him from the other side of the fence, so he's just crying over there, but he'll stop soon. Hopefully in the next slide there will be no more Cedar cries. So we're going to understand united and divided, understand some key terms about how political landscapes change at large, but understand primarily that these are voter driven. So that'd be tipping, party realignment, party de-alignment, and then we'll have a good understanding of political parties that'll set us up well to have a even greater understanding of their role in the electoral process, which we will dive into in next week's lecture on campaigns and elections. Keep having to pause because these animals are just going crazy all around me. But all right, let's keep going and understand what a united and a divided government is. And no, this has nothing to do with their capacity to work together, and it is instead indicating the structures of representation within our three electoral bodies. Who has the majority of seats or the executive seat within our three elected bodies? That being the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency. So the legislative and executive branches are all under one party leadership. That would be a united government. We currently have a united government, not because they're doing a great job working together, but because they are all led by the Republican Party and majority numbers. So we see the House currently has Republican majorities, the Senate has a Republican majority. We see that through leadership within these bodies, with the House having the Speaker of the House and Mike Johnson, and the majority leader within the Senate, John Thune. Apologies for the cat. So we know that our united government, and of course we know our president currently is Republican candidate Donald Trump, and now Republican President Donald Trump. So we know that summarizes a united government. We also know that a divided government is when one of those bodies is ran by an opposing political party. So you would see a Democrat held House, Senate, or presidency, and then every other body being held by a Republican. We know that prior to the previous election, under Joe Biden in his the second half of his one-term presidency, the Democrats did have control of the presidency and the Senate, while the Republicans had the majority seats over the House of Representatives, representing a divided government in that instance. And key distinction here, just knowing that it is the two bodies, the legislative and executive body, being governed by one majority political party. That is a united government. Now, political parties at large. We're going to look at three different levels of a political party. Loosely speaking, the politicians, the activists, and the voters. But we're going to give them more political science-oriented terms to understand this. And it makes sense when you really visualize a political party. So when we look at political parties at large, it's important to understand the benefits that we argue that they provide. They provide a shortcut for political decision making. What do I mean by that? Say you are an individual who is not highly politically engaged, but you care about an issue that's impacting your life, say housing prices. Well, you identify a strategy to address housing prices that you believe is efficient and will address your needs within this grander issue. Well, a specific party is representing that policy approach. But the other topics of immigration may come up later down the road, and you just are not that involved in that later issue. Well, Many individuals believe that political parties provide a shortcut for political decision making for downstream issues when it comes to importance. So they would be able to identify that uh, if the political party that I align with regarding housing policies is implementing this immigration policy, I will likely support that immigration policy. So it's a shortcut for political decision making in lower tier policy issues. We also see that it encourages representatives from different regions to work together. You think of it simply as, do you think a Republican in Montana and a Republican in California are similar in nature? They probably have wide-ranging policy differences. They probably have cultural differences in their origins and what they think it means to be, say, American or Californian or Montanan or maybe even Republican. So this political unity enables people from opposite sides of the country, from different cultural backgrounds, to unite under a general umbrella identification. Now, those are the two primary benefits that political parties, in a general sense, provide. But we have to acknowledge, hi Mo, that there are also some downsides. And in the recent political climate, there is a rapid increase in political polarization among the political parties and the general public. So we see that political parties, when structured and operating under certain circumstances, certain graduate work like my own and other research papers identify a degree of nationalization contributing to a greater extent of political polarization within political parties. Although that is not something you will have to remember in this course, we do know that political parties and the role and structure that they maintain, or the strength of political parties, which many political scientists analyze, strong or weak political parties, contributes to either high or low levels of political polarization. In recent years, high levels of political polarization, which coincides with low levels of bipartisanship. So, what are these three faces of the political parties? So we have the party in the electorate. These are the members of the general public who align with the one party, with one political party. Think of it as we are in the electorate. We elect the individuals to govern our country. And then you have the structural representatives, the activists, the party organized. Oh, Mo, don't be pushing my laptop. The party organization. This is where you have those structured positions. These are the hired and paid staff that are often representing a political party, various campaigns, and general organizing efforts. So think of, these are the people you might see having an influence on certain campaigns, certain messaging efforts, while not having a name that you would think of off the top of your head. While we have party in government, these are the names that we know. These are the big ticket representatives that we like to focus on at election cycles and whenever we want to have accountability within government. So that's the elected and appointed officials that identify with a particular political party. It is essential to understand that any political party represents and requires all three of these dimensions to be effective on any level. So we see the party in the electorate, us, the party organization, the workers behind the scenes, as every industry has to have some degree of paid staff, and then party in government, the elected representatives that run the campaigns and govern and are the avenue for the party and the electorate to maintain accountability within political parties. So, what does a political party do? So, they recruit candidates for public office. It's important to understand that we have an electoral process that operates in a primary and then general election. In the primary process, the political party plays a significant role in identifying candidates to run for their political party. It's important to understand that if you are interested in local government on any level, it is very easy to be one of these candidates that they are supposedly recruiting. All you have to do is make yourself seen by the political party, reach out to them. They have accessible emails, phone calls, and oftentimes front offices in public in downtown areas. So you see they have that main responsibility of identifying candidates to bring forward to the party in the electorate to determine who the party in government may be. We also see they organize and run those elections, particularly primary elections. When we talk about the campaign process, we're going to explore Momo. Hey there, be kind. We're going to explore how the primaries are driven and ran exclusively by political parties. This is an avenue in which we've enabled political parties in our past to be highly restrictive regarding access for minorities at the polls, but we do see that those issues have significantly improved in recent years, and it is the arc of moral justice goes upwards, I think is the quote. different topic, but we see that they have that responsibility of organizing and running those primary elections in particular, and running the general elections for their candidates, ensuring that they get public access to press, they have those access to debates, and various things of that nature. We also see they have the responsibility of presenting alternative policies to the electorate. This is a key dimension of political parties. When they are not in majority power, they are the organized opposition, as we see as the last point as well. The organized opposition representing alternate approaches to governance. So those 2 points should put them together, correlate in many ways. So we see that structured opposition. If you feel like your government is not representing your needs, there is a political party that is a roadmap for representation for those who are alienated or disenfranchised. We also see they accept responsibility for operating the government. We have a multi-member government. Simply put, we have many, many individuals taking accountability and responsibility for the actions of our government. Political parties enable us to have greater and easier accountability for those when they may make mistakes. They may govern outside of our interests. Not just can we hold the individual accountable, but we can hold the organizations and institutions that they represent accountable, their political parties. All right, so we have to understand why we have the two-party system we have today, especially relating political parties. We oftentimes see the general public expressing dissatisfaction with the stickiness of our two-party system. Well, Duverger's law explains why we have the electoral system we have today, the two-party system. It does so by asking two primary questions. How many votes are needed to get representation? And secondly, are people encouraged to vote honestly or strategically? So first, how many votes are needed to get representation? This you can see in proportional representation systems, which we do not have in the United States. Sometimes they need only as little as 5% to be represented within government on some level. So if you only need 5% of the vote to have representation, you are encouraged to vote more honestly, because all you need is 5% of the general population to align with you for you to, in a sense, win the election. Now, say you don't have a proportional representation system and instead you have a winner takes all, an electoral system in which the individual with the most votes gets the entirety of the office. Say you're having a election for one seat within government, or the winner of that election, no matter if they only got 20% of the vote, as long as they got more than everybody else, they would win that seat in office. Say you're voting for a 100-person body. If you had 5% of the vote, you get 5 seats in the office. That's the general sentiment of a proportional representation system. We'll look at that later on. The key here is understanding that the difference. One system requires 5% to have some form of representation. The other could require as high as 50% to have some form of representation. Well, if you need 50% of the general public to vote in the way you do, you might be encouraged to vote strategically, to think which of these possible candidates is closest to my views and most likely to win the election. While if you only had to get 5% of the population to align with you, you are far more likely to think that there will be enough to align with you that you will win some form of representation. And you will not be encouraged to vote strategically to avoid a worst case scenario, which would be your opposing candidate from winning the election. Now let's simplify this and restart. Actually, the next slide can give us a good visualization of how Duverger's law works. All right, so here's another way of looking at Duverger's law, and I'm going to walk you through the example once more. So let's remember, we have single member districts in the United States. That is, we as in one geographical area, from here to Flathead Lake, although that's not necessarily a district. Say that's the geographical area that's voting for a candidate. When we elect one individual to represent an entire district, the second and third place finishers always get 0 representation. What's the psychological effect of having only one candidate win an election and represent an entire district? Well, it is that in these districts, people do not want to vote for a known loser. Say somebody represents everything you believe. They are exactly like you in political nature, but they are polling very poorly. They're only getting 5% of the vote, and they need 50% to win the election. And there are 2 other candidates, one of which is your worst case scenario. The other is somebody that's not exactly like you, but they're closer than that worst case scenario candidate. So the psychological effect is you may vote for your second tier preference because you know your true preference does not have as good of a chance at getting 50%. Now, say it's 5% they need, you may vote for your first preference because you think it is more likely that you'll get that 5%. So strategic voting in American electoral systems is what occurs. You have that need to get 50% roughly, sometimes as low as 20s, 30s, but that's a topic for next week's lecture. You see that need for strategic voting. If the person that most closely represents me, that third party candidate, that libertarian candidate, is not polling well and does not have the party support to get 50%, I will strategically vote for that other candidate. Let's say the Republican candidate, because my worst case scenario as a libertarian voter in Montana maybe would be a supposed Democratic candidate. I'm just throwing names out for an example. Doesn't matter. So this hypothetical person, this hypothetical libertarian, may strategically vote Republican, although they are libertarian in nature, to avoid a Democrat gaining the seat in the legislature. That is strategic voting. Duverger's law asks those two questions: how much of the vote do you need, and are you voting honestly, to answer why there is a two-party system in the United States and why there are not two-party systems elsewhere, although there are in many states. But in the states that do not have two-party systems, this law explains that. So you can't talk about the political parties without having at least a brief dive into the contemporary political parties. And here I try to provide a very general summary of these political parties, focusing on their traditional and historical foundations, which we've already done in the ideologies and philosophies lecture. So this is just a quick summary, revisiting while placing it in the lens of a policy impact perspective. So democratic political parties have a tendency within the majority of their representatives. These are not hardline facts, these are majority summaries. A Democratic political party candidate is more likely to have a heavy focus and emphasis on national social programs. You see Social Security emphases, unemployment protections, welfare implementations, and Medicaid protections being a foundation of many Democratic policy advocacy points. You often see these Democratic candidates aligning with the identities of environmentalists, urban communities, as we've seen that geographical tendency for partisans to divide geographically within the United States. We do see LGBTQ plus communities tend to gravitate towards this political party, although not exclusively. And liberal identification. We remember from the previous lecture the foundations of liberal political thought, driven and grounded by traditional liberal political theorists like John Locke. We also see Republican virtues, and the impact that it tends to have on policy is that they have a heavy emphasis on traditional values and institutions. Maintaining traditions, emphasizing and maintaining that sentiment of the Edmund Burke, father of conservatism, that the best progress is progress that is done slowly, that is inherited from generation by generation. You see these collectives and Republican candidates have a tendency to align with religious groups, rural communities, nationalist focuses on nation first, libertarian camps advocating for diminishing of government interference, although we see that as in conflict under certain Republican candidates, and conservative values at large, which remember presented by the foundations that were first sparked by the works of Edmund Burke. I also want to focus on one cool little detail that I'll probably rant about again next week, but we oftentimes see this Democrats and Republicans as blue and red, this connection in our mind with color visualization of the party identities. But it's very important to understand that this blue and red connection did not exist prior to the election of 2000. It's a generally recent construct. Prior to 2000, we saw political parties like the Democrats being summarized on national broadcasts with orange or purple or green. They used wide-ranging colors, just two different colors whenever they had their maps, and it was network-based. And it was because of the election of 2000 being so heavily nationally broadcast and having such a prolonged period of analysis in which we did have the Supreme Court rule on who the presidential nominee, president-to-be, president-elect, was. We saw that we all identified these parties with the colors that the national broadcasts were using at that time during that election. Neat little detail that a lot of us overlook throughout history. And There are also some researchers by the names of Matt Grossman and David Hopkins that have an analysis of asymmetric political polarization in recent years that identify nuances between the two political parties, identifying the Republican Party to be primarily an agent of ideological movements whose supporters prize doctrinal purity, while the Democratic Party is better understood in their lens, in their analysis, as a coalition of social groups seeking concrete government action. You see that's their way of summarizing these political parties and their recent analysis along the lines of political polarization in their recent publication, Asymmetric Polarization. That summary I just provided is from a direct quote from page 220 of their book. And, of their book. So, now we get to talk about the fun ones, the third parties in the United States. And while we have a dominating two-party system and we don't have much of a focus on third-party candidates, they do persist every now and then in presidential and lower-tier elections. So third-party candidates are candidates that do not align with the Democratic or Republican Party, oftentimes identifying with Green parties, Whigs are old, libertarian parties, the Reform parties, various, nuanced individual third parties that form in any given electoral cycle. They oftentimes persist multiple electoral cycles and, to the hope of the party, persist continuously. We see that they oftentimes represent minority positions within government. You see a lot of ideologies like socialism, libertarianism, extremist interpretations of mainstream positions, communism, and much more fostered within these third parties on some level, although I would be sparingly in saying the communism aspect in American political environments, just like you could also argue libertarians are not, are rarely ever adamantly implementing that ideology within government, as there is no advocacy for anarchy by any elected representative at the moment. So you see these nuanced dimensions, but advocation for the legitimization of conceptions of governance that were not previously legitimized within the general public are represented through third-party candidacies. And we also have to revisit that concept, pluralism. Third parties do exist because we are a system of government in which two or more groups, principles, or sources of authority coexist and vie for power within this single system. Remember, there is a wide-ranging approach to identifying and defining pluralism as long as you summarize the multiple groups within single systems. So let's talk about 3 specific elections with third-party candidates that obtained a notable percentage of the popular vote. First, we're going back in history, and this is the only one of the 3 that will eventually become the president. We see Theodore Roosevelt. This is the 1912 election in which Theodore Roosevelt represented the Progressive Party and obtained the most votes a third-party candidate has ever obtained in a presidential election. You can see in the background there the 1912 map, although it's horribly botched. You can see that general visualization. Although not obtaining the majority of the vote, although not winning the election, revealing the powers of third-party candidates under certain circumstances. The winner of the election was Woodrow Wilson, who beat the incumbent William Howard Taft. Roosevelt had already served 2 terms as president. He did run once again, and this was prior to the 22nd Amendment. He did run again to push out against William Taft, who was his predecessor previously, who was his successor previously, who he believed was not representing the office and the party well. So Roosevelt ran to advocate against Taft winning the presidency, and his obtaining of 27.4% of the popular vote and 88 electoral college votes is what many political scientists point to as the reason why we had Woodrow Wilson as president in the 1912 election. So let's continue on to the next presidential election that garnered significant third-party votes. This one is very representative of issue politics. We will explore later on in this course the 3 things that drive voters to vote the way they do: party loyalties, issues involved, or candidate characteristics. And we will see this is the one where issues involved had a lasting power. So it is 1968. We have just implemented civil rights protections and made significant efforts to desegregate the schools of the South, the public schools of the South. Well, there was a third-party candidate who represented and was, at the time, the governor of the state of Alabama. He wanted to run for president, representing a party platform that is driven on the sentiment of bringing back segregation. So a pro-segregationist platform was led by George Wallace as he ran for the Independent Party. This Independent Party in the election of 1968 obtained 13.5% of the vote, the popular vote, and 46 electoral college votes, running almost exclusively off the sentiment of pro-segregationist policies. The winner of this election was the president that we know infamously due to the Watergate scandals as Richard Nixon, beating the incumbent incumbent vice president as Stanford president Hubert Humphrey. This represented a pro-segregationist platform. You see sentiments by George Wallace, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, echoed in his campaign speeches that garnered 13.5% of the popular vote in 1968. We also see in this photo to the right a very infamous photo of George Wallace as he stands in front of a school trying to refuse the first desegregated student into the school. This required the federal government's involvement and the National Guard coming in and escorting the student into the school, as you see the individual standing in front of George Wallace with the intimidating look as he knows he is about to win this moment. This photo being a visualization of the time and the conflicts of simple civil life for many Americans in the South. Now we see this election was one of the foundational elections for sparking the political party realignment that created the two-party system that we have today. This led the realignment of Southern Democrats to align with the George Wallace presidency campaign for president via their independent party, who they later realigned within the Republican Party in later elections. So we see this being a key characteristic of party realignment, which we'll explore in just a few slides. Now it's 1992. We got George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and you can't forget about good old Ross Perot, running on a Reform Party platform, calling for the mediation of the two-party system. We need more moderates in government, is the general sentiment echoed by Ross Perot, appealing to a large percentage of the population. Although not obtaining any electoral college votes, he was able to obtain 18.9% of the popular vote, and a lot of the votes he was able to pull, although came largely from both political parties, enabled the winner of the election being Bill Clinton in 1992, who would go on to serve 2 terms. We know that this campaign by Ross Perot represents a grassroots campaign strategy, focusing on the sentiments of the general population and then moving those sentiments upward in governance and representation. We see that this also reveals some of the logistics and requirements for debate and campaigns. As we saw, Ross Perot was one of the first third-party candidates to end up on the debate stage with the 2 primary candidates. And we learned that the requirements are that you have to be on the ballot in enough states to possibly win the election if you want to be a part of the national presidential debates. So that being, you have to be able to possibly obtain 270 votes. You can run for president in only one state. That is legally possible, and we've seen many individuals do it, and even win somewhat notable percentages of votes within those states. And we've even seen candidates run in like 10 or so states, and we've seen candidates drop out of races without before being able to meet those deadlines and still have their name on the ballot in numerous states. Now, if you want to be on the stage for a debate, you have to have the possibility of obtaining 270 electoral college votes. You also have to maintain roughly 15% of the public support via a collection of public opinion polls. This requires multiple public opinion polls, as they aren't official vote counts, but it does provide a general summary of the polling data you have at the time, which enables the debate committees to determine if they will enable a third-party candidate to contribute to a debate. So we see those are the general requirements that were maintained for having possibilities and qualifying for debate regarding third-party candidates, establishing a precedent for the future and maybe some boundaries that will enable later third-party candidates to get on that debate stage, as Ross Perot had in 1992. So how does the political party landscape change at large? We know there are just general periods where you see unique candidates obtaining a large percentage of the primary vote or federal vote to reveal a sentiment within each political party. They don't even have to win a election to reveal mass collectives, mass percentages of a party are feeling disenfranchised or some level of dissatisfaction. We see recent political party candidates, especially when you look back at 2016, like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump representing that quite well, maintaining their allegiance within the political party systems while still shifting the landscape of the political party and the voters who identify with them, revealing segments of the population that were disenfranchised previously, not feeling like they were adequately represented by the status quo of either of the two parties. Now, there are three terms we have to make sure we understand when it comes to how political parties change, led by the voters. And it is very important that all three of these terms rely on large numbers of voters doing this and has nothing to do with the actions of political party candidates or political parties in government. So make sure you have that distinction, as it will result in point deductions. A party realignment is when a substantial number of voters leaves one party for the other, while a party de-alignment is when a substantial number of voters do not identify with either of the two political parties. Now, these are in contrast to each other, as party de-alignment is represented after with Ross Perot's presidency as presidential candidacy, as he obtained a large percentage of the vote. Same with George Wallace, same with Theodore Roosevelt, as they represented many voters disenfranchised from either of the dominating political parties aligning with a third party candidate. We also see so that is what happens oftentimes prior to a period of party realignment. So we look at 1968 as our most notable, most recent period of party realignment. In 1968 election, we had the George Wallace de-alignment, and the following elections, we had a realignment of all those previous individuals, large percentage of the voters that voted for George Wallace now voting for the Republican Party when they previously voted for the Democratic Party. So that realignment brought the political landscape we have today, in which you have Southern Southern individuals voting at large numbers for the Republican Party and the Northern urban individuals voting for the Democratic Party. While that was not always the case before the 1968 election. We also have to understand a key term, tipping. And I always use an old documentary that nobody's seen that's on Netflix. It's Wild Wild Country or something like that. It's about a cult. They all wear orange and they moved to a rural county in Oregon. So they were from another country. It doesn't matter the logistics of the organization. But we do see that when they moved to this very rural area in Oregon, they were one little population. They bought a house, built a commune, and they just kept growing in numbers. Over time, that commune grew in numbers so much so that they had voting power within the community. They were able to vote their own individuals into local public office seats without having to appeal much to the general population. So we saw that as a population that was growing in size so much over time that it brought a shift in the political balance within their district. Now you can see this happening on larger scales with various demographic groups. So tipping is when a group is growing in size over time to an extent that it shifts the political balance within your district, state, or country. Now, as I previously mentioned, we'll just fly through this because I've already addressed it. The 1960s party realignment. This is the period when we had the most recent realignment of our political party system. We know that a large reason why we had this realignment is the presidential candidacy of George Wallace, as he was able to pull a lot of the disenfranchised individuals from either the Democratic or Republican Party towards his pro-segregationist platform. Now, after he lost the election and later did not run for re-election, later did not try again to run for president, we see those 13.5% of the general population realigning within the Republican Party when they previously were known at large as Dixiecrat Democrats by some political scientists. Now it's important to know that that's the identification of the Democrats within the South around the 1940s to 60s. We see a strong pro-segregationist sentiment among this general population. We see Strom Thurmond, the individual who holds the record for the longest filibuster in U.S. history at 24 hours and 18 minutes, I believe, when he filibustered the Civil Rights Act in the 1950s and resulted in its failure within the Senate. We see Strom Thurmond represented these Dixiecrat Democrats within the South. And then as he stepped away from his political leadership roles in the 1950s, sorry, my cat's just going crazy. The whole lecture never happened like this. In the 1950s, we see George Wallace stepping in a decade later to represent this collective and move them towards third-party candidacy, and then later after his forfeiture of running for president again, we see that collective moving to the Republican Party. So, and voting for Nixon in 1972. And that is where we see the contemporary Democratic and Republican political parties being born, and of course adjusted in the most recent adjustment, in the most recent political party realignment. Here's those What Have We Learned slides. Make sure you go through them. And if you have any questions, reach out to me, and make sure you go through the modules to see what is due this week. Go through your readings. Those are important. You might have quiz questions relating to your readings here and there. And reach out with any questions. Thank you guys for listening to me rant. One more week. You're making great progress.